Hi everyone. In this video, I want to go over some information about modern poetry that will help you make sense of the reading this week. This week we're focusing on the work of T.S. Eliot and also the Imagist poets. So just for some context, I want you to remember what poetry of the 19th century was like traditionally. If you think of the poems by Paul Laurence Dunbar, for example, you might remember that they were what we might call, lyric poetry. I don't know what's happening here. There we go. So these poems were short. They had one speaker for the whole poem, and they were personal in nature, expressing the thoughts and feelings of that one speaker. And they were typically written in traditional forms using regular rhyme schemes and regular patterns of rhythm as well, regular meter. So, for example, the sonnet had 14 lines of iambic pentameter, or a lot of poems were written in 4-line stanzas with a regular meter and rhyme scheme. So let's move into the 20th century. And before we talk about poetry specifically, I just want to give you a quick refresher on modernist themes from the modern period, right? The modernists questioned authority. They addressed taboo subjects. There was a lot of despair in the writing, reflecting all the upheaval of the early 20th century. They struggled to make sense of a changed world. There was what they saw as a loss of meaning. Things didn't make sense anymore. And that often resulted in this sense of alienation, loneliness in an unknowable world. We get this idea of fragmentation, things falling apart in society, but also the fragmented self. And we also see the theme of the wasteland, the world in decay. That'll be especially important this week. And also a theme is the artist as the hero, the artist being the person who can really see things in a way that can bring people together, bring everything back together and make things whole again. Okay? In terms of the form and techniques, remember Ezra Pound's dictate to make it new. To call attention to new poetic subjects and write about them in ways that make us see ordinary things in new ways. So that, for the modernists, many of them at least, required experimentation, new ways of using language. So we get in modern poetry a lot of free verse, poetry that doesn't have a regular pattern of rhyme or a regular pattern of meter. There still might be rhythm and rhyme in there to an extent, but there's not going to be a regular pattern to it. We get stream of consciousness, like we saw with Hemingway, free associative, it's nonlinear. We also see a breaking down of boundaries, the mixture of different kinds of writing, different languages, and so on coming together. A lot of ambiguity. The reader has to search for meaning and put clues together sometimes. Along with that, unresolved endings. We might not exactly know what happens at the end of a text. And alinear plots. Things might not follow a chronological order. We get that fragmentation in the way that a text is written. Okay, so keep all of these things in mind this week when you're reading modern poetry. So, the first text that I want you to read is one of America's most beloved poems by T.S. Eliot. It's called The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And in many ways, this is a lyric poem. It's going to express the thoughts and feelings of its speaker, who happens to be J. Alfred Prufrock. There's a lot in the reading guide that I want you to pay attention to here, but I just want to give you just a taste of the poem, these opening lines. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. A couple things to note here is that first there's an invitation, right? There's a first person inviting you, I guess the reader. And we get this image of first this idea of movement, let us go, but also this image of paralysis, right? Like a patient etherized upon a table. Maybe not a very pleasant image. And those are the opening lines. It might be hard to know what to make of that. As you read the poem, I want you to think about this speaker, Prufrock. Who is he? What is he like? And what does he want? And the title of the poem is The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. So where's the love song in the poem? What does a love song have to do with this? I love this poem. I can't wait to talk more about this poem with you and see what you think about Mr. J. Alfred Prufrock. And then we're going to be reading The Wasteland. Now, The Wasteland is the most complex text that I'm assigning this semester. This poem is long and it's hard, but I don't want that to intimidate you. I want you to try to embrace the challenge. I want to just look at the opening 4 lines and then another set of lines further down to sort of set the tone for the poem. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. So right away we get a reference to cruelty and to dead land, dull roots. We get this possibility of spring, right? Lilacs. We get this idea of something growing out of death. But again, this reference to the dead land. Remember, the poem's title is The Wasteland. And then a little further down on that first page of the poem, the speaker asks, what are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images. I want to suggest that these 4 lines are really important to understanding what's going to come up in this poem. First of all, this idea of the roots is a callback to these first 4 lines, right? The speaker is asking, what can grow out of this rubbish? If we're in the middle of this wasteland, is there any potential for new life? But notice how he tells us, you cannot say, for you know only a heap of broken images. So think about what that is saying about the condition of the modern man or the modern person, and this idea of being surrounded by a heap of broken images. Think about the poem as a heap of broken images. I think that the speaker is asking us as readers to make sense of it, and it's not easy. So when you read this poem, I want you to know that it's supposed to be disorienting. When you're reading it and you don't have any idea what's going on at all, that's what T.S. Eliot was going for. He's trying to recreate what it felt like to be a human in this very disorienting world. Look for the fragments. Look for changes in speakers, changes in languages, changes in settings. This poem moves from place to place and has different speakers throughout instead of just one speaker. Look for the modernist themes, and also use the resources. I highly recommend that you listen to the link that I've provided. I think it makes the poem make much more sense if you listen to it being read and follow along with the text as you're reading so that you can annotate too. All right. Let's talk about Imagism. Imagism is completely different from what we've been talking about. T.S. Eliot was not an imagist. Imagism is a school of poetry within the modernist movement. It's a very particular kind of poetry. And in imagist poems, the poem itself creates just one image. Just one. And in fact, that's the entire poem, is that image. So the poems are very short. They're compressed and concise. Ezra Pound wrote about, he wrote something called an Imagist Manifesto, and in this he described the absolute freedom in the choice of subject. The image could be of anything. Think about that, that sculpture that I showed you in a previous video with the urinal mounted on the wall. Absolute freedom in choice of subject. And imagists always wrote in free verse without a regular rhyme scheme or a regular pattern of rhythm. Here is probably the most famous imagist poem. It's called The Red Wheelbarrow by William Carlos Williams, a Latino modernist author. He wrote a lot of poems. Not all of them were imagists, but this one is an imagist poem. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. That's it. That's the poem. And the idea is that he's creating an image of a wheelbarrow. It's wet, and there are some chickens beside it. That's the poem. Many scholars tried to find meaning in it. They said the color red must represent communism. The chickens must represent food. This is about the distribution of food. This is a commentary on communism. None of that is true. This is a poem about a red wheelbarrow that's glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. That's the idea of imagism, nothing else. Okay, so this is the imagist poem I want you to be most familiar with, but there are a couple others in the syllabus as well that I'd like you to take a look at. Very different from what T.S. Eliot was doing. Okay, so this week, it's probably more important than any other week to use your reading guide. Read aloud if you can, or listen to somebody read the poetry. Poetry is meant to be heard. So as often as you can when you read poetry, either read aloud or find a recording or ask somebody to read it to you. Give it your best. When you're reading The Wasteland and you don't understand what's going on, just keep going. Try to get the overall feeling of the poem. If a particular line doesn't make sense, don't worry about it. Just try to get the gist of it and don't give up. And look for what the poem reveals. Look at what it's trying to tell us, not what it's trying to hide, but what it's showing to us. And finally, don't forget to ask questions. There is a separate thread in discussions this week just for questions. I will try to check on that every day so that if you have questions before your posts are due, you can ask them there. We'll have our usual discussion, optional virtual discussion. And I look forward to hearing what you have to say, reading what you have to say in our virtual discussions and our the discussion posts this week. Okay, have fun with this. Give it your best shot and embrace the challenge. Have a great week.